There's also some evidence that these guys were employing the empirical method. So if you look at medicine today, what we advocate is a process of examination, diagnosis, treatment of the condition, and then development of a prognosis to try to figure out how the patient should do moving forward. At the same time, though, it's important to note that these guys were using some methods that we would definitely not advocate today. And those are things like placing animal dung on cuts and abrasions in order to treat them, and on wounds. And there are also studies of their lists of medicines, and I should say that medicines should be placed in quotes, because these have revealed that actually very few, if any, of these things had any medical value at all. These were just things that the Egyptians were taking in the hopes that they might actually do some sort of good. Now, the Greeks, of course, took a page out of the Egyptians' book, and a lot of Greek advances were based on the things that the Egyptians found out. And in many ways, the Greeks are the ones who are responsible for modern science as we know it. At the same time, we have, of course, been influenced by discoveries and methodologies of the Chinese and the Indians and the Arabs. But these were things, these discoveries and this knowledge, these were all incorporated after the Greeks had established this framework that we have used actually since their time in many ways. And these guys were interested not only in practical questions, so trying to figure out medicines, for example, for treating patients, or figuring out how to set up your agricultural field in order to take advantage of the flooding, but also just things that were interesting from a more theoretical standpoint. And that definitely is something that we see now in science today, where you're interested in knowledge simply for the sake of having more knowledge. So that field would kind of be known, generally speaking, as natural philosophy. And in many respects, the father of science, although there are many people, I should note, that are given this name, is Thales. And Thales was alive in the 7th century BC, and he was the very first person, as far as we know, who proposed non-supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. And one example of this is earthquakes. And so rather than thinking that earthquakes were started by Poseidon in the water, or by whoever would be responsible for them on land, he suggested that actually all of land is just floating on water, and there's some natural perturbation of the water, and that makes the floating land masses jiggle around, and that's what we perceive then as earthquakes. Now obviously he didn't quite have that one right, but the idea is that he wasn't looking for an answer that had to do with some sort of supernatural being, some sort of god. And there are in fact tons of Greek scientists that I could mention here, and these people actually wouldn't have called themselves scientists, because that was a term that wasn't coined until 1833, as a matter of fact, by William, I actually don't know how to say his last name, but it's kind of like Whewell, and he made invaluable, and all these Greek scientists made invaluable contributions to what we now call the field of science. And so I'll just run through a few of these that are probably really good for you to know because they are so important. Now the first, of course, is Pythagoras, and I've already kind of set this up because I've mentioned already his triangle and how important these calculations have been in engineering and elsewhere. And he was one of Thales' students, and he actually studied mathematics for its own sake. So like I said, there was no longer this desire to necessarily only study scientific things because you could come up with a solution for something, but simply because these things are fascinating, and it's just kind of a mind-bending exercise to figure out what can you do with your own brain, and what sort of things can we figure out to try to understand what's going on in the natural world. And based on all of his kind of calculations and observations, he was the first person to hypothesize that the Earth is round rather than flat. And he also developed, of course, as I said, this theorem that I keep alluding to. Now, in honor of Pythagoras and his contributions to mathematics, which I should mention are so closely related to what we now call science and keep separate from math, that's why I'm incorporating it here in this larger discussion. So in honor of Pythagoras, I'm going to be playing the White Stripes singing Black Math. And that was the White Stripes singing Black Math. And you are back here on Source 96.1 FM on the wild side, and today we are going through a brief history of the Western world's science. And I was just, before the break, going through a list of some of the Greek scientists that have contributed to our knowledge and our, basically our whole scientific process as we know it. And I mentioned Pythagoras, to whom that song was dedicated. And the next on my list is Leucippus. And Leucippus was from the 5th century BC, and he was the first person to propose the idea of atomism, which is to say the theory that matter is made up of tiny units called atoms. Now obviously, Leucippus' idea of what an atom was and what it looked like and how it functioned was probably not what we think of today. But at the same time, he actually is the person who is responsible for the word that we now use to describe these units, and also for the idea that there is in fact some very tiny particle that makes up everything that can't be split up without getting rid of the properties of that particular product. The next person on my list is Plato, who's a bit later. He comes from the 4th century. And Plato and Aristotle together are responsible for advancing the study of nature by kind of a systematic approach. So they would go out and look at things and try to figure out what was going on by using a process of deductive reasoning. So they would use a series of logical statements in order to arrive at a principle. So one really great example that everyone tends to use is, for instance, the statement that all men are mortal, followed by the statement that Socrates is a man. So then, using deductive reasoning, you then have to say, well, if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then it follows that Socrates, therefore, must be mortal. So this was the sort of reasoning that they would apply to all sorts of things to explain the phenomena that they were seeing out in the wild. Now, of course, I said that Plato worked closely with Aristotle, and Aristotle is the person who's responsible for the concept of empiricism. So the idea of testing things in order to figure out what's going on and wanting to see concrete evidence in order to base a decision or an idea on that, rather than just conjecturing and coming up with things that have absolutely no logical foundation in reality at all. So he wanted to use observations and use inductive logic. So here we have both deductive reasoning and inductive logic used together to draw conclusions. And this really is what gave rise to the modern scientific method. So using the things that you see to come up with ideas, but also trying to think logically about them and kind of fill in the gaps with some ideas, some new ideas of your own that you could then test and have empirical evidence for. So Aristotle, I should also mention, is responsible for lots of very important biological writings as well. And he classified and dissected dozens and dozens of species, and in many cases is the first person known to have encountered or looked at or explored in any real detail lots of these different species. And actually a lot of scientists I know always kind of get a kick out of going back as far as possible and finding a nice Aristotle quote in order to stick into their paper so they can have the earliest possible citation you can think of for an academic article. Now Aristotle was followed by, well, by lots of people, but notably by Hippocrates, who lived in the 5th and 4th centuries. So actually he kind of overlapped Aristotle a bit. And he described many diseases and conditions for the very first time. So Hippocrates was interested in medicine. And you'll probably recognize his name in association with the Hippocratic Oath. And he developed this oath that physicians still use today in taking care of their patients and balancing the needs of everyone that they work with, including themselves. And he was followed by some of the first work that was based on actual dissections of the human body. So people didn't do this for a very long time because it wasn't really considered a very nice thing to do, and it was not socially acceptable. It was also quite difficult to do these things back then. They didn't quite have the tools to do all of this and not get ill and to do it very well and not clumsily. So once Hippocrates started diagnosing diseases and describing conditions, it got people interested in looking more closely at more minute characteristics, such as the nervous system. And Galen, for example, in the 1st century AD, performed highly skilled operations following up on the work of Hippocrates. And some of these things were not actually attempted again for millennia, so thousands of years later. For example, he did operations on the brain and the eye. And I have to admit that when I was doing some reading, I never did find out whether these operations were successful or not, and you really do have to wonder about that given when he was doing these things and the sorts of conditions that these operations would have been under.